My mom was a small, very pretty woman, but she was, we called her the Steel Magnolia. I mean, she ran our home. There was always the appearance that my father was taking care of, decision making. Everybody knew she was really running our family, but she kind of ran everything. My mom, as I remember her, is quite a bit younger than I am now. But she was, I said, a very pretty woman, a very vibrant woman. She ran her home, but she ran pretty much everything. She was president of the Booster Club. She was president of the Garden Club. She was president of the PTA. She did run the church bazaar. She did run the youth group at our church. My parents were really a very close partnership. They had married when they were young. My mom was in her second year of college. She was 18 because she had graduated from high school when she was 16. My dad was 20. So they used to laugh and joke that they grew up together. She was a very creative person. We had a beautiful home. I was laughing the other day about, my dad was an engineer, and Mom was always redecorating. And we lived in a brick home in Texas, and she would say, Ralph, I wish that window were about 6 feet over. Would you just move that window? And he'd do it. And then she'd redo the whole house around that. But my house was where all the slumber parties were. Our house was where we had brick floors in our den. We'd have sock hops, when we were teenagers. Everybody, all my friends loved my parents as much as I did. When I was in high school, I had a friend who was, frankly, treated very badly by her family. She was, I believe, abused, and she lived with my family for a while. I mean, our house was always open. It was a lot of fun to be in Etheredge when I was growing up, and she loved polka dots. She loved malt balls. She loved white linen pants. She loved people. She loved me. We had just moved to Kansas City and came from Dallas, where we had grown up and lived most of our lives. My dad had died shortly before that, Anna, so when Truman bought this business and we moved here, I said to my mom, just come with us, help me get the babies settled in, and then we can figure out whether you want to stay or go back to Dallas or whatever. And Mom had been having some GI issues and had been seeing a family physician in Dallas for several months, and everyone said, oh, it's just grief, it's over the loss of your dad. And we got here and she got worse, and we didn't really have a health system or doctors in place. So she went over to KU, and we learned that she had stage 4 esophageal cancer that had, her stomach was implicated, and we knew, my mom knew a lot about this because unfortunately her mother had died of the same disease at just about the same time in life. My mom was 51 when she was diagnosed, and she was given a 50% chance to live. Well, let me back up. They told her they thought she would not live 6 months. But she was given a 50% chance to live up to 2 years if she would consider having a surgery that had not been done in Kansas City at that point. It had been done at the University of Chicago to remove her entire stomach and to make a stomach for her out of large intestine, and if she would consider an experimental chemotherapy protocol, which was FU5. Mom missed a tennis lesson the day that she got her diagnosis. She was not very happy about having to miss her tennis lesson. But she was a young woman. She was a vibrant woman. And when we went home, on the car ride home, neither of us said a word. We got home, and she walked straight through the house, went outside and did some gardening. and came back in the house and took off her gloves and sat down and said, I think I know what I want to do. And she decided to take a very aggressive course, which made complete sense to do that. And she was almost successful. She lived 1 week short of 2 years. But the experience of her illness and the experience of our family through that was really profound on all of us. There were no hospices at the time of Mom's death. It was in the mid-70s. Actually, Mom died the year that Florence Wald started the very first hospice at Yale New Haven. But Mom had grown up as a rancher's daughter, and ranchers' families don't spend a lot of time in the hospital. It's just too far to get back and forth. So my grandmother had died at home, and my mother had been her primary caregiver. So Mom knew what she was facing, pretty much, although the chemo and the surgery were brand new. But she also knew how she wanted to do this. And so she became very directing. My mom is a really smart woman, and we were blessed to live very close to Kansas University Medical Center. And our neighborhood was populated with young doctors and nursing faculty, and really we became kind of a neighborhood project. People couldn't believe we were going to do this at home. We had fought the good fight, and on Mother's Day weekend, Mom had an emergency admission to the hospital. Bile duct had been blocked, and she just literally just blew up like a little toad frog, she said. When they did the surgery, the doctor who had cared for her throughout this entire time, who was then the chair of the Department of Surgery at KU, said that it looked like, when they opened her, it looked like someone had thrown a scoop of gravel, and everywhere it had landed there were tumors. So she said it's time to go home, and she was very clear that she did not want to come back to the hospital. She did not want any further treatment. Now, her doctor, who is deceased but a marvelous human being, Dr. Lauren Humphrey, was known to be a pretty rough and tumble, kind of stereotypical head of the Department of Surgery. But he really got into this with us, and so we were able to bring her home, and with our whole family and all of our neighborhood and Dr. Humphrey, she was able to die at home. Mom was buried on the land that she grew up on and where she played. As a child, and I've never known the exact date that my mother died. I've chosen not to do that because things became so strange and intense. Night became day, and I've just chosen not to have an anniversary of her death. But I know that she died in mid-July, and where she is buried is a little family cemetery, and there was no one really in this community left who even knew my mother. They knew family, and a few people came, and the Baptist minister came to say prayers over her. Her funeral service had been in Dallas, where we had grown up. But it was so hot that day, and I said to this young minister, you get this over and get her in the ground as quickly as possible. These sweet old people will have a heat stroke if we stand out here much longer. But I stood at her grave and said to myself, here's what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. I'm going to try to figure out how families can have similar experiences to ours, which was really an anomaly then, but it won't have to be so hard for them. What we had to do to keep my mom at home was really pretty bizarre. I mean, we broke laws, we did all kinds of things to keep her at home. And, I have said I had no idea, and the promise was not to God, the promise was to me. It was just, this is what you need to do. I had no idea what that meant. I thought one of the things it meant was to come back to Kansas City and start a hospice, and which I did. I got involved with the Visiting Nurse Association, and we started a hospice, and I chaired that board. And I feel really proud to have done that. But I also decided to go back to the university. I had, like many women my age, dropped out of college, gotten married, had 2 kids. You know, I'd been president of PTA and started swim leagues and did church work and all of that stuff. But I thought, you know, I want to take this opportunity to go back and finish my education, which my mom always wanted me to do. But I also thought that it would give me some time to kind of think and reflect on what this experience had meant. It was not long after Kubler-Ross had published her important work on death and dying. And frankly, death and dying courses were really kind of the rage. I mean, they were in churches and synagogues, and they were at community centers and in universities. So I thought, well, I'll just go over to UMKC and sign up for a continuing ed course in psych of death and dying. And I couldn't quite make that work, so I just signed up for a regular course, and I hated it. Hated every minute of it. A behavioral psychologist taught the course, and she had lost a child to cancer a few years before. And I felt that she used this course to kind of perpetually grieve for this child, which I can't imagine losing a child. But I didn't want to do what she was doing. I wanted to talk about decision making at the end of life, was really what I wanted to talk about. And she wasn't interested in that. So she suggested to me that there was a philosopher on the campus, Dr. Hans Uffelman, who was really interested in the things that I wanted to talk about. You know Hans, and I went and met him, and he told me, Hans was not very fond of Johnson County housewives. He kind of thought they were the lowest of the low. But he said to me if I was a serious student, he would consider working with me. So I ended up spending 7 years at UMKC with Dr. Uffelman, who was one of the founders of the center, and studied and became a supplemental instructor in the Department of Philosophy with Hans. And then he and Mary Beth Blake, who is currently the chair of our board, again, God love her, and Karen Ritchie, a young psychiatrist who was not in Kansas City very long after the center started, about 1.5 years, maybe 2 years. Thought it would be a good idea to start an ethics center, and they asked me if I would consider doing that. So I was ready to do something with what I had accomplished at the university, and I had looked at some other opportunities. One was to work with Myra Etheredge to redo the curriculum on end-of-life care at UMKC at the med school. One was to work with Blue Cross Blue Shield to see if we couldn't get them to pay for good end-of-life care. And then this opportunity came along, and I said, sure. So that was 32 years ago this month. And my mom was a deeply religious woman. She was one of those little Southern Baptist ladies, and she would say to me in the midst of her illness that I should not fret about this, that God had a plan, and that we might never live to see it, but this was not evil. Good would come from this. Now, I'm not that person, and I would rail at God and would say to her that I was afraid she had my file mixed up with somebody else's because I couldn't imagine how anything good could come out of this. As the years have passed, I think of that from time to time, because I think the center has done good things. And the reason I am at the center is because I wanted to make meaning of my mother's death. I wanted others to have the kind of, this sounds so bizarre to say, but we had really a marvelous experience. As my mom was dying, she was an amazing teacher, and she wanted to do it her way. And I wanted other people to be able to have similar experiences. We're all going to die, so we ought to do it the right way. We ought not to do it in an intensive care unit somewhere.
Had you had any of these conversations with her before her diagnosis?
Well, because my dad had died 5 years before she died. My dad died of a sudden coronary event at age 50. And so we had talked a lot about unexpected death and, living your life to the fullest, and, always telling, no matter how many times you left home in a day, to be sure that you said, I love you. But not about the stuff we delve into, but I've done some writing about our experiences, and one of the things that I have written about is that this last hospital admission, when Mom was told that the game was over, she had been admitted to the hospital through the ER. So the policy and protocol of that hospital was whoever the admitting physician was then remained with you through the course of that hospital stay. And this was a young gastroenterologist, which was an appropriate person to see her in the ER. But he didn't really have much relationship with my mom. When she was admitted, we were in the midst of redoing our kitchen. We were talking about kitchens earlier. And we were redoing it around a spice box, a German spice box I had given to her when I was a little girl. And everybody has seen these spice boxes. They're white porcelain, and they usually have red or blue bands or black bands, and then they say salts and zucker and And this, for a variety of reasons, this spice box had been really special between my mom and I. And so we were painting kitchen cabinets white and having a blue and a red reveal done and writing German words around these cabinets. And one day when she was out of intensive care on the med-surg floor, when I got to the hospital that morning, she had her back to me and she was crying. And I said, Mom, what's going on? Are you in pain? No, I'm fine, And I said, no, you're not fine. What's going on? And she said she was afraid she wouldn't get home. To see the cabinets. So I said, no, we're going to go right now, and we'll see the cabinets. So I went to the nurse's station and said, Mom and I need to go home for a little bit, and we'll be back, but we need you to do whatever to get us home. And they said, well, she couldn't go home, that the doctor would not release her. And I said, well, you want to watch two women walk out? Because we're going home, so we can figure this out. I need your help. She still had IVs. And so eventually the nurses really got behind it. And we had to sign out AMA, against medical advice. And I said, that's fine. We're going to be back. It's fine. And they had to get a line in place that they could keep open, and I had to agree. She lay down in the back of the seat of the car, and we just hung the bag of saline on the coat hook. And we went home, and she saw the kitchen, and she was still where she was not supposed to have very much food, but she said she'd really like to have a cherry popsicle, so we stopped at Quick Trip, got a cherry popsicle, and we went back. And when we got back, the young gastroenterologist was waiting for us, and he was just in a tizzy. I mean, I thought he was going to have a stroke. He was so angry. You know, the veins in his face and neck were bulging. And he said to me, did you not realize that you could have killed your mother? And my mom, who was in a wheelchair at that point, and she probably weighed about 80 pounds at that point. She was never a large woman, but she had become very, very thin, said to him, "Oh, you poor little fool. Did no one tell you that I am dying? We need you to go on now." And he turned and left. So my mom was very confident about who she was and what she wanted in life, and she didn't tolerate fools very well. So in response to your original question, what I do is because of what I learned from my mom. Mom was cognitively intact until 2 days before her death. She slipped into a terminal coma, but she was running the show, not me. But where we had lots of conversations and lots of discussions was about what had been and what she hoped would be. And, you know, I want to believe every mother has this. I have this. In the bottom of my mother's closet, there was a box that we were never, ever to touch. I had 2 brothers, and we touched everything. You know, we were just little hellions, really. But we knew that that was Mom's box, and we were never to touch it. And, you know, I grew up in one house. My mom never moved until my dad died. And but when we moved here, we were in an apartment originally, and, you know, the box came with her. And then when we moved to our home, the box came from the apartment to our home. And one day she said to me, after we had come home to die, she said, "I want you to get the box. Get my box. I want to go through it." And the box was full of some really strange and wonderful things. Press corsages from her youth, wooden spoons from picnics at the lake, love letters from my father. She wanted to look at these things, and she wanted to dispose of them. And she wanted to tell me why they were important to her. You know, we, in the late 90s, we did some work with Bill Moyers around his documentary On Our Own Terms. And we helped him to develop the public outreach materials for that documentary. But he asked me one day if I would write a story about the intersection of technology and humanity at the end of life. And I actually have still a book outlined on that topic. And so I said, sure, I can do that. And I said, how many pages, And he said 700 words. So I think it was Woodrow Wilson who made the comment about how much easier it is to speak for an hour than it is for 10 minutes. But and the same is true of writing. But the story that I wrote for Moyers and that was published in the outreach, I thought a lot about that, about what an amazing teacher Mom had been and how those lessons had endured over time and actually across generations now. And so I wrote a story about a quilt. My mom was not one to do needlepoint, and she was running the Booster Club, or she was running the church bazaar. She was, she wasn't sitting at home doing handwork. But a couple of weeks after we were home, she said to me, my mother always called me Myra Jean. She was Southern, so she said, Myra Jean, I want to make a quilt. I said, really? And she said, yeah, I've decided I want to make a quilt. And I said, well, okay, we'll make a quilt. What's the deal, Mom? And she said, dyeing is really boring, and I've got to have something to do. So we found the address of a quilting shop over in Overland Park, and we bundled her up. And at that point, she could get out for very short little jaunts. And we went to this quilting store, and she picked out this pattern. And she picked it out because I think it's probably the simplest quilting pattern. But the sort of irony of this has never escaped me. It's called Grandmother's Garden. And it starts with a piece of fabric about this big that's octagonal. And then you just keep building around it. And so she worked on this quilt, and I would sit with her, and again, I've said this several times, she was a very clever woman, but she would pick up a piece of fabric and she would say things like, this reminds me of the dress you wore the first day you went to school. And then she would say, we were always proud of you because you were a good student. She said, this reminds me of the dress I had on the day I met your dad. And he said to me, I look like a bale of cotton candy. I look so sweet to him. So through this quilt, she was able to tell all these family stories, and she was able to talk about what's really important in life. So as the quilt became a marker of time passing, and I said to her, now, Mom, I want a king-size quilt. And I don't want a twin or anything. And as the quilt was being pieced, she was getting more and more frail. And she was not able to finish the quilt. 2 years later, so I just put it away in a chest, a cedar chest. And 2 years later, unknown to me, my sweet in-laws, I had just marvelous in-laws, took the quilt top. Neither of them had ever done any quilting. And they finished piecing it and bought a quilt frame and quilted on it for a year, and they gave it to me for Christmas. So this quilt has a lot of love and care stitched into it, a lot of stories. But over the years, this quilt has, I can show you the quilt, this quilt has all this special status in our lives, and we have used it for a bed covering. We have used it for a picnic cloth. Our oldest daughter was proposed to sitting on this quilt at a picnic. We have, when the girls would move when they were in college, which they seemed to do a lot, the quilt always came, and we would wrap mirrors or, something special in the quilt. When our grandson, Georgie, came home from the hospital, we wrapped him in the quilt. And the picture that Moyers put in his resource guide was of me rocking Georgie wrapped up in the quilt. He was probably, 2 or maybe 3, because the quilt let me teach him his colors. And I still always remember so fondly that I would say, "This is yellow, George," and he would say, "Yellow, yellow." So we still in our family say yellow, you know. So again, Mom's stomach and her esophagus, at the end of her life, she did not have the capacity to consume food and absorb food. And she knew that, and if she would try to eat, it would make her violently ill. She would have projectile vomiting, and so the doc. I think it was the last time the doctor came. He agreed to do house calls. He is deceased now, so I can say this, but he made me promise I would never tell anyone that he had made a house call. So the last day he came to the house, he said to me, "You need to just stop everything by mouth. There's no way it can benefit her. It's just going to make her sicker." And I mean, it's hard. I think it's hard for people to understand really how sick she was. When she died, she weighed about 65 pounds, and they said that probably 10 pounds of that was tumor. I mean, she was just so emaciated. And so I did. And we had kind of a routine. Now, she died in the summer, but I would get the kids up and get them off to swim team and all that stuff. And then I would bring her breakfast tray, and I would sit with her while she had her breakfast. And then when the kids came in from swim team, it gave me a break to take her tray down and do a little bit of kitchen work. But the girls, BK would read the paper to her, and Brandon would wind. BK was 10 then, and Brandon was 6. And Brandon would wind her music box and rub lotion on her. We were trying to keep tissue from breaking down, but those were their little jobs. And then I would have her lunch ready, and I would bring her lunch up, and and we would watch her favorite soap opera, As the World Turns. And so we kind of had our day paced around particular things. And at the end, she was no longer able to come downstairs, so all of her meals were in her bedroom. And so after Lauren said, "Don't give her anything else by mouth," I said, "But what if she's hungry?" And he said, "She's not going to be hungry." So she realized the next morning that I didn't bring a breakfast tray. He came late one afternoon. That I did not bring a breakfast tray. And she said to me, "Why didn't you bring me a breakfast tray?" And I said, "Well, Mom, Lauren said that really it was just making you sicker." I said, "Now, if you want something, I will absolutely get you whatever you want." And, we had done, she loved watermelon. She was Southern. So we had done things like juice watermelons so she could sip on watermelon juice for weeks. And I said, "If you want watermelon juice or a cup of tea or, anything, I will get it for you." And she said, "I can't live if I don't eat." And there was just this horrible silence between us. And she said, "I know that I'm not going to live. I don't want anything right now." So she never had another sip of anything or bite of anything. My dad died of a massive coronary at home. And my mom grieved and grieved and grieved because she had given him half of a 5 milligram Valium because he was anxious. And she was sure that killed him. And so ultimately, we had to arrange an appointment with the emergency physician who had been the attending the night my dad was taken to the hospital, for him to tell her, "Mrs. Etheredge, if your husband had had that heart attack here in the ER, he would have died." I think it's just human nature, because we so do not want to lose someone we love, to think could I have done something differently? What if we had done this? What if we had done that? So, of course, when Mom died, I thought, oh, God, should we have kept trying to feed her, And I knew we should not. I mean, it was absolutely without any logic. But emotively, oh my God, was I complicit in her death? And frankly, I have said many times, the reason I think we all but torture the dying is because we're such cowards. Because we want to make damn sure that when all is said and done, that we can say, I did everything possible. And I think that's a coward's way out. But I often, when I'm in conversation with families and they're struggling with what do we do, and most often the families we talk with, they don't have a mother or a loved one who's still making their own decisions. They have become the surrogate decision makers. I think about how difficult that moment was. That was the only moment in the entire process that I had that sense of, am I really doing the right thing? Is this I knew it was medically right, but is it morally right? Is it in keeping with, the covenant I have with my mother? So I think I had a tiny glimpse of that. And I cannot tell you how my heart breaks for families that struggle with these things. It's one of the reasons I'm such a huge proponent of advanced care planning, because nobody should be in that situation. We should know what our loved ones want and simply be their agent. She was so sick that I rarely slept for a couple of weeks. And we were so stupid. And God loved Lauren, Dr. Humphrey. Frankly, he knew so little about what we were trying to do. No one ever offered to us home health. It never occurred to us. We either thought she was in the hospital or she was ours. And other than Dr. Humphrey coming every, week or so, and other than those wonderful neighbors that I mentioned who were young physicians and nurses and stopping in and saying, hey, how's it going? We were on our own. And again, historically, that's not atypical. Physicians would say, we've done all we can do. There's nothing more we can do. Go home and get your affairs in order. Well, that's just bullshit. There's always something more you can do. That's what palliative care is about. That's what hospice care is about. That's what, spiritual support and counseling and all of that is about. It's about that aspect of the process. But, again, Mom died in 76. Kubler-Ross published her book in 69, if I remember correctly. So it was at the very beginning of this movement to transform end-of-life care in this country. That was almost 40 years ago. So our experience was so bizarre. I mean, I think people thought we were wackadoodles. Lauren had to go out of town. He didn't have to go out of town. He chose to go out of town to a medical conference, which was a good thing to do. And we knew that Mom would probably die while he was gone. So we had talked with the funeral home. He had talked with them. He said to me, just call the funeral home. They will come and get your mom and take her for her body to be prepared. So Mom died really early one morning, and my brother and his wife were with us, had come. And the kids awoke, and the questions were, we told them that their grandmother had died, and we all sat with her. And this is true of all children. They were really, they adored my mother. They were really sorry that she left, but they wanted to know, do we need to go to swim team? How are we going to get to swim team? And so I called one of the neighbors and said, we didn't really need the girls in the house while all of this was going on. I didn't really want the girls in the house when they came to get Mom's body. And said, will you just drive? My mom died about an hour ago, and we're in the process now of getting her body transported. And if you would take the girls to swim team today, that would be really helpful. Well, what we didn't know, and Dr. Humphrey didn't know, was in Johnson County, if there was an unattended death at home, there had to be a police investigation. So whereas we had this all planned out, we didn't have it planned out. And the next thing I knew, early in the morning, there are fire trucks and ambulances and police cars pulling into our driveway. Fortunately, we lived in Fairway, Kansas, which is this little tiny community, and the police department knew us, and they knew what was going on. When the police officer said to us he had to come into the house to file his report, he literally walked into the house and turned around and walked out. But here we have all of these people, so including 2 young paramedics who were there to transport her body. Well, they were there to take her to the hospital. She had been dead an hour before we called anyone. And then when all of this started happening, I said to Truman, just get the kids to swimming, get coffee for these people. We've got to get a hold of Lauren. We've got to track him down. He's got to figure this out with the coroner and the funeral home and the fire department and the police and whoever else is here. And so my sister-in-law and I have been friends since we were 8 years old. So my sister-in-law is more like a sister. And she and my mother were very, very close and had been all of our lives. We decided to get Mom ready. I said to you earlier, my mother was a very pretty woman, and she was a very particular woman about her appearance. And she wore a wig for 2 years. And she was beginning to get pressure sores from where she slept in her wig, where the wig was. And I had said to her, Mom, I think we need to deep six the wig. And she said, you do not take this wig off of me. So when she slipped into a coma, I took the wig off of her. But I said to my sister-in-law, before the paramedics get up here, we've got to get this wig back on her, and we've got to get her makeup done, because she would have a fit if anybody saw her looking like this. So while all this drama is going on downstairs, Diane and I are just getting her ready, and Diane said to me, well, I think we ought to do her nails. And I said, well, yeah, let's do her nails. So finally, Dr. Humphrey spoke to the coroner spoke to the police department. They agreed to release her body for transport to D.W. Newcomer. I can't imagine if they had taken her to KU. But that was the plan. So when the young paramedics came up, and they had been in our house for probably about an hour and a half at that point, with all this stuff going on, and the kids had come back from swim team, and our youngest said Petey wanted to see dead grandma. Could she see grandma? And I said, well, Petey will have to ask her mother if she can see dead grandma. I mean, I don't know. If it's okay with Mrs. Prof, it's okay with me. It'd be okay with grandma. So the paramedics come up, and they're putting her on the gurney, and they grab her ankles and grab her at the arms. They're going to swing her over onto this gurney. My sister-in-law says, be careful, her nails are wet. And they looked at us like, oh my God, we have got to get out of this house. This is a house of horrors. It wasn't a house of horrors at all. It was a house full of people who loved and cared about one another and who were really trying as hard as we could to do what she had told us to do, if not in that moment, that she had taught us all of our life to do. We've made enormous progress. You know, it is now reported that more than half of all those who die in America each year are assisted by hospice. There were no hospices, so that's pretty significant. However, I don't think we ought to get too proud of ourselves about that because, frankly, most of those people are assisted by hospice for a few days or even sometimes hours. The hospice palliative care movement has been incredibly slow, and for a whole bunch of reasons. We are a death avoidant culture. We don't want to talk about death. We also worship science and biomedical technology. We believe that if you just take one more pill or you have one more surgery or one more round of chemotherapy, you will continue to live. Well, that's foolishness, we know, but that's what we want to believe. So I said for many years, this sounds indelicate, but money runs medicine. It just is. It would be wonderful to say it's about the milk of human kindness, it's all about compassion, it's all about money. And in this country, maybe others, I don't know, but I said for many years, we need a business case. You know, what we need to do is to be able to say to hospital administrators, CFOs in particular, look, not only is this what people want, not only do we now have data that it provides better care, better quality outcomes, and not only do people live longer, actually, when they get this kind of care, it actually saves you some money. It costs less. But people were afraid to do that because they were afraid that the American public would hear it as, oh, they're just trying to save money on the dying. You know, they don't really care about the dying. And nothing could have been further from the truth. With the passage of the Patient Protection Affordable Care Act, which moves us from volume-based reimbursement, so hospitals and doctors get paid more the more they do to you, to a value-based model where they get paid based on value. So outcomes that are desired, which, you know, an outcome, a desirable outcome can be a death that is dignified and consistent with the patient's goals and values. That underpins what people now call Obamacare. I still prefer to call it the Patient Protection Affordable Care Act. One of the things that really worries me, you know, see, oh, be careful what you pray for, about where we are now, is a lot of it is about the business. It's about, you know, I had a call from an oncologist a couple of years ago who we've worked with for a long time. He's a wonderful human being. And he said he had never seen so much interest in palliative care since the passage of the Affordable Care Act. And the person most interested was the CFO. Now, that's not a bad thing. I mean, again, healthcare in America is a business, and you have to be able to figure out how to make it work. And that's true if it's for-profit or not-for-profit healthcare. It doesn't matter. But I worry that we're going to lose the philosophy that underpinned all of this. I serve on a committee at the American Hospital Association called the Circle of Life, where we have for, I think, about 15 years now, given 3 awards a year, up to 3 awards each year to hospitals nursing homes, hospices for excellence in palliative care. I see a difference in the last few years, and we've talked about on the committee that when we do site visits, what we're looking for is really, have they been able to hold on to the philosophy that underpinned this whole movement? Can they do both? Can they do mission and margin at the same time? If it's just about margin, we're not interested in them. I'm always a little cautious because I don't want to sound hubristic. I don't want people who would hear this to think the center's the kind of place that brags a lot, because we're not. In fact, I think sometimes, reflecting back on the last 32 years, that we've been too humble about things. The center started what is the oldest ethics committee consortium that continues to function in the United States in the mid-'80s. And we did that because we knew that with the newfound powers of biomedical technology, really the capacity to sustain bodily function virtually indefinitely, that there was this tension between what people wanted, what families wanted, what the science, what we could do and what we ought to do, between the is and the ought. And so we thought that a way to help institutions grapple with these issues and to help families grapple with these issues was through the establishment of ethics committees. Now, we've done a lot of, we've worked with more than 200 ethics committees across the country. And we've done a lot of teaching and training with them. And in those sessions, I have said there are two kinds of people in hospitals. There are the verticals and there are the horizontals. And the verticals have all the power and control. So what ethics committees were intended to do was kind of to prop up those horizontals so that there could be some semblance of shared decision making. So it was not just about the science, it was about the values and the goals of that person or that person and their families. So in the course of doing that, there was an absolutely marvelous physician here. You may have known him, Dr. Carl Strauss, who was at Menorah. And Carl one day we had so much, let me back up, we had so much success with getting hospitals to agree to start these committees, we couldn't take care of them. So we decided to bring them all together and we would form this ethics committee consortium. And that way we could sort of manage our resource better. So at one of those meetings, Dr. Strauss told a story that he had been at Shalom, which is a long-term care facility, with a dying patient. The family was there. They had called him just to come and be there because he had cared for this woman for so many years. And in the course of this, which was really a sacred time, a sacred ritual, a nurse aide got scared because this woman was doing what we call Cheyne-Stokes breathing. Her breathing was very labored and irregular, and the doctor and the family are just standing there. So she called the ambulance. She called the paramedics. And they rush into this sacred space, and they don't care that Dr. Strauss has taken care of her for all these years. They resuscitate her, and they take her to the hospital, where she lived in the intensive care unit for 3 weeks, never regained consciousness, and ultimately her little body just said enough. So Carl told this story and said, if any group could figure out how to manage this, certainly this group could do that. So There were then living will statutes in most states in the United States. I'm not sure Missouri had passed theirs yet. Kansas had been an early adopter of that. Missouri was very late to the party. But we said, okay, so what if we did this? You guys represent 36 hospitals. What if we began to work together with the Bar Association and the Med Society to promote this living will document that basically just said, in the event that I'm terminally ill, I don't want you to do a bunch of life-prolonging stuff to me. Let me die. So we went to work on that, and the Bar Association, the Med Society. So ultimately, we developed a document that everybody agreed to, which everyone said you'll never get everybody to agree to this. The doctors and the lawyers will never agree. What they did, we identified 300 volunteers and trained them. And in 1 year, we did 1,000 community-based programs at hospitals and churches and nursing homes and women's PEO and young matrons and junior league and, anybody who wanted to hear this. Rotary, my God, I can't tell you how many Rotary Club meetings I've been to. But we established the very first community-based advanced care planning project in the country. Now along comes the Cruzan case. The Nancy Beth Cruzan case was the first so-called right to die case that was ever heard by the U.S. Supreme Court. In fact, it's really the only right to die case. I hate that nomenclature, but that's what it is. And it was very public. This was about a young woman in her 20s who had been in a single car accident, had been permanently unconscious in a vegetative state for several years, when her family said, Nan would never have wanted this. We need to stop the artificial nutrition and hydration and allow her to go. Now, this was a family who had done everything. They had taken her everywhere. They had called every kind of specialist. They had prayed. They had everything they could do. And in the midst of all of this frenzy, one day I got a call from a young attorney. We get calls from attorneys all the time, especially young attorneys. I've just gotten a call and I don't know what. So this was a young man named Bill Colby, who was at Shook-Hardy-Bacon, and he wanted to know if I knew of literature about artificial nutrition and hydration and any stuff on the ethics of all of this. And actually, New England Journal had just published the studies, the work from a major task force looking at vegetative state, and that had been an important part of their project. So I said, oh, yeah, I've got a lot of stuff around here about that. And he said, could I get it to him? And I said, I'd be happy to do that. And I said, I can mail it to you. And he said, well, no, I'm working on a deadline. I've got to file a brief today, and I need some references, some citations. And he said, can you fax it to me? We didn't have a fax machine. And I said, I am so sorry, but we do not have a fax machine. And he said, well, if I sent a cab, could you put it in an envelope and could they pick it up and bring it to me? So we did. And at the end of that conversation, which I will never, ever forget, I said, Colby, what's this kid's name? And he said, her name is Nancy Beth Cruzan. And I have said over the years, no one could have convinced me at that point what that young woman's name and her family's experience, her experience, would mean to me personally, would mean to our center, would mean to this country. Because frankly, the Cruzans had been told that if they took her home and didn't feed her, what our family did, they would be charged with murder by the state of Missouri. The state of Missouri was the plaintiff in this case. So we became very involved in this case. Now, and we became very close to the family in this process. The center has tried very hard not to become a political entity. And so we did not file an amicus brief in that case because we felt it had become more of a political issue, a legal issue, than an ethical issue. But we were very much jettisoned into the national limelight because of our work with that. So I think that our work help that case to be decided in an appropriate way. Now, in the midst of this, Senator Danforth, who was then our senior senator in Missouri, he was faced with a political situation where the governor of his state is driving this case, where they had said the sanctity of life was so important in Missouri they could never allow this family to discontinue feeding and hydration. And yet all the public opinion polls said, in fact, the citizens of Missouri think this is the decision of this family, that Governor John Ashcroft and the Missouri State Legislature ought to have nothing to do with this. It also happened that in the midst of this same governor and same legislature agreed with approving an execution in the state of Missouri. So Danforth's office called and said, we've been trying to figure out what's appropriate for us to do around this. And we've heard about this living will, community-based living will project that you've got going. And we wondered if you would be willing to talk with us about it, because we think that the solution to this conundrum is not legal cases. It's really about education. It's about educating the American public about reframing this discussion. So we had the opportunity, Senators Danforth and Moynihan, Patrick Moynihan from New York, so Republican and Democrat, sponsored legislation that we helped write. It's called the Patient Self-Determination Act. They were kind enough to invite us to come with them to the Senate the day it was introduced and to be part of the press conference following that. So as things turned out, we were pretty sure when the Supreme Court decision would be made. We were pretty sure that it would be made the last day before the July break, because the justices would want to decide whatever and then get out of town as quickly as they could. Patient Self-Determination Act actually passed in April of that year, and then the Supreme Court decision was June 30 or something like that. So again, because of the passage of this law and people knew that we had been instrumental in that, we had the opportunity to go all over the country and to educate people about that. And then because of our involvement with the Cruzian case. Now, the American Hospital Association came to us and said we need help with figuring out how to do this. So we wrote a monograph for them and helped them to figure out how they could approach it. But we went to it was then the Joint Commission for the Accreditation of Healthcare Organizations. It's now just the Joint Commission. And to say to them, hey, we're here and we want to help you with this. And we thought that day, we had done a little bit of work with them on patient rights issues, in particular about do not resuscitate orders. And we said, we want to work with you to figure all this out and to build it into your patient rights and organizational ethics standards. So we thought it would take us a couple of years to develop a relationship sufficient that they would say, sure. That day they said, yes, we want to work with you. And within a couple of weeks we had a contract done. And so we worked with the Joint Commission to develop resource materials, a seminar called Beyond Compliance, because what we wanted to do was to we're always wanting to push the edge of the envelope. So the Patient Self-Determination Act says, if someone comes to your hospital, you have to ask them, do you have an advance directive? If they say no, you have to say, would you like to have one, and would you like to have some help with that? You also have to be willing to offer them information, materials and information. And it says, hospitals that we accredit, you have to also be doing public education about this. Now, and if you don't, then you'll lose your Medicare reimbursement. Unfortunately, it's been a toothless tiger because Medicare has never had any funding to really enforce this, and the hospitals, it's pretty much become a check the box. I am sure you've had this experience. Most people have had. Do you have an advance directive? Yes. And I say, well, don't you want to know about it? Do you want to see a copy of it? Do you want to know who my durable power of attorney is? You know. So anyway, what we wanted to do with the Joint Commission was to move from this kind of regulatory, legalistic approach to really more of an ethics approach. You know, the work we did with the Joint Commission, I think, has really been instrumental. We also, I mentioned Medicare. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services provide all the reimbursement for publicly funded insurance programs. And we had spoken at a conference, and a young woman with CMS, which is where is CMS? They're in Baltimore, I think. They're in Maryland, I believe. Said, I want to talk to you about this for nursing homes. So the center actually partnered with them to hold the first national conference in the country to talk about end-of-life care for nursing home residents. Now, what a novel idea. We have worked with AARP to develop materials and programs for their members. We have worked with the National Association of Attorneys General to establish end-of-life care as a consumer protection issue. The center has been a major player. We've worked with the National Health Lawyers Association. And again, I don't want to sound too puffed up about all of this, but in 1995, there was a study published in JAMA that we had known was coming for some time. It's called the support study, and I don't really remember what the acronym stands for anymore, but it's something like the study to understand patient preferences regarding treatment or at the end of life or something. And this study was done in 5 major teaching institutions across the country. And it was, the co-PIs were Dr. Joanne Lynn, who's really one of the, I call her the pioneer mother of the whole end-of-life movement, and Dr. Bill Knaus, who is the creator of Apache, the prognostic software program, 2 brilliant physician researchers. And so they did an 8-year study that was 2 phases. The first phase was a baseline. They looked at 5,000 patients in 5 academic centers. All of them, to be enrolled, their physician had to say, I think this patient will die within the year. So these are really seriously ill people. And they looked at, let me think what all the measures were. Length of stay in intensive care, the timing of do not resuscitate orders, advanced care planning, psychosocial spiritual care, and pain management. There were 5 measures. At the end of phase 1, the data were so horrible that the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which had funded the study, asked the PIs to withhold publishing because they were concerned it would frighten the American public. The data basically said people are in ICU units on average for 14 days, away from their family, friends, pets, toys, whatever. Most of them are unconscious at the time of their death. They're hooked up to everything. I say everything but the vacuum cleaner at the hospital. Of those who are conscious, the majority of them were in pain and unable to get medication and treatment for their pain. When patients had an advance directive, most often the physician hadn't read it. And, you know, the ICU is not a place where a lot of psychosocial care goes on. So they agreed that they would hold publication until the second phase, which is an important part of this, but it was based on training special nurses to facilitate communication inside the hospital. And so they did that, and they spent another 4 years. Each phase was 4 years, another 4 years. And they then gathered up all their data, and they looked at the data, and there was no significant difference in the data. And so, to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's credit, they said, we need to publish, and we need to use this as a springboard for a major effort to change end-of-life care in this country. So the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation invited 100 people to Washington. I was invited, as was Don Reynolds, who was on our staff, an attorney who's now at the Bioethics Center at the University of Missouri in Columbia. And so here we go. And because we had known this research was being done, we had been talking about we need to do something in Kansas City, we need to do something community-wide, and so forth. And so we were in the process of developing a project called Pathways to Improve End-of-Life Care, a communities approach. So we go to this meeting, and I found it very interesting in many ways. All of those who spoke were men. There was not a nurse, and nor was there a woman who spoke that day. And I was sitting next to some person who I thought was nice, and we just chatted, and I commented, I wonder what idiot thought this project would work. And she said, well, I'm one of those idiots. I'm at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and I'd like to talk with you about that. So we did. We talked that day, and what I said to her was, the support study was based on the belief that death is a medical event, that it is a clinical event. Death, we believe, is a community event. It is so complex and so complicated. So we were invited to come to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and talk with them about what we were doing. We did that, and then they said they wanted to come here, and they wanted to meet the people we were working with, and we did that. And then over the course of a year, they kept inviting us to come to meetings of one sort or another. And ultimately, we were asked to direct a $11.5 million project for them called Community State Partnerships to Improve End-of-Life Care. And what the foundation did after all of this thinking, they created 3 major programs. One was called Promoting Excellence in End-of-Life Care. Dr. Ira Byock ran that program. Another was called Last Acts. It was run by the foundation. It was really a communication, public education campaign. And the third was ours, which was called Community State Partnerships. And it was for the purpose of building infrastructure across the country that was really based on the work we've done here in Kansas City and based on the Pathways Project. So we worked on that project. We directed that program for about 6 years. We published a legislative policy briefing around that project that went to every legislator in the United States, state and federal, for 8 years. Again, I don't want to sound too proud of ourselves because there's so much work to be done, but we have been a major player. We have done all this work around living wills, and I said, we've trained all these professionals, doctors, nurses, social workers, even a few lawyers. And Don Reynolds, who I mentioned earlier, was the person in charge of our advanced care planning initiative at the center. And so Don came into my office one day and said to me, "I'm not doing this anymore." And I said, "Well, what are you not doing?" And he said, "I'm not doing any of this advanced care planning stuff." And we didn't talk about living wills at that point. We had moved to where we were talking about health treatment directives and durable power of attorney. And I said, "So this is the job you have here. Why is it that you don't want to do that?" And he said, "Well, I'm not going to lie to people anymore." I said, "Well, this is an ethics center, and not lying to people is a good thing. What is it that you think we're saying that's not true?" And he said, "We say to people, if you take the time and effort to complete one of these documents and sign them and have them witnessed or notarized, your wishes will be known and honored, and it is not true." So I said, "Then what are we going to do about that? Because we're not in the business of doing that." So we began to talk about what was really needed. That in fact, we all kind of knew what Don was saying, that this legalistic approach of sign this document, check this box, it really had virtually no impact in the clinical environment. And what we all owned when we sat down was that if in fact the family had had a lot of conversation, they were kind of all on the same page, the doctor knew the family, the doctor knew that the family and the patient were in sync, these issues just never came up. They were taken care of. That it was the conversation that was important, that it was the process, it was not the document that was important. So we said, then let's abandon the focus on the document and let's talk about what we could do to promote the conversation. So we came up with basically a conversation guide that I think this was really quite wise, and I'm sure it came from Don. I don't know exactly who should get credit for this, but we'll say it was Don, who said, you ought not to start out by saying, "Do you want to be on a ventilator?" Who the hell ever wanted to be on a ventilator? So we created this conversation guide that starts by asking people really what's important in your life. And, in ethics, we talk all the time about patient-centered goals, setting goals that are consistent with the patient's values. So what's important to you? What has brought joy to your life? Where do you have regrets? What are things that you wish had been done differently? And we ask people about, what are your concerns, your spiritual concerns, kind of a nosy body approach, just tell me all about you. And then after someone gets through this process, then you would say, okay, given this, what does that imply to you about end-of-life issues? So Ellen Hockaday was on our board of directors at that point, and Ellen had, and she has talked about this publicly, so I'm not telling stories, but she had shared that her family and Irv's family had had very different end-of-life experiences because, in part, her mother had been able to be very self-directing. In Irv's family, decisions had to be made for parents, and it had not been as easy. So we brought Ellen into the process and said, share some of this with us, help us think about this. So we shifted from talking about living wills and health treatment directives and durable powers of attorney to talk about having caring conversations. Now, I think pretty much the whole field has moved in that direction. And I think, it just is true that we are a very legalistic country, and we all like to have our I's dotted, T's crossed, and a big notary seal on something. the power of that piece of paper is it just says to a physician, a clinician, we've done this. And in particular now with the way hospital care, acute care is structured, where your family doctor doesn't go with you to the hospital, but intensivist or hospitalist or whichever model that hospital uses. These people have probably never seen you before. So it gives them assurance that, in fact, there's been conversation and they're not going to get caught in some big buggity-boo with the family. So I could not believe more strongly how important it is for families to have these conversations. It was for my own family. It is for every family. I don't have much faith in the approach of the signed, sealed, and delivered. I just don't think it makes a lot of difference in the clinical environment. But we've had the opportunity to work with the Centers for Disease Control at their Center on Aging Studies on these issues. They fortunately agreed with us that this is really about how do we get people to talk about these issues. I mentioned we've worked with Bill Moyers on these issues, worked with the National Association of Attorneys General. So I think the center has had a strong voice in saying we need to move away from legalistic approaches, really more towards a communication model and one that's more consistent with families and the clinical experience. Most of us will die of advanced age and multiple chronic illnesses. And more than 80% of us will not have capacity at the time of our death. So others will be making decisions for us. So there are a lot of ways you can think about this. You can say, well, I want to be darn sure they do what I want them to do. I don't know that really makes so much difference. I think really what we want to do as responsible adults is to make sure that we don't leave our families struggling with, did I do the right thing, with the uncertainty, potentially having regrets about decisions that they made. It's really hard to lose someone you love. And you don't want to leave as your legacy turmoil in your family, your kids feuding about, well, you did this, but mom wouldn't have wanted that. It's just silliness. So I have said for a long, long time that this is really not so much about making sure that they do exactly what you want them to do, as it is to make sure that you kind of protect your family and make sure that when all is said and done, that they do have peace of mind, that they were able to honor you, respect you, and that your family remains intact. I think it's really, really important. I will talk with kids and adult kids and parents, and the adult kids will say, well, mom won't talk about this. And mom says, I can't get the kids to talk about this. They're hard conversations to have. But, hard conversations are usually important conversations to have. And so what I have encouraged people to do, particularly when you're talking about adult children talking to their parents, not to say, Mom, I need to know if you want to be on a ventilator or not. It's ridiculous. But to say, Mom, I need your help. Or, Dad, I need your help. You've not been well, or you're getting older, and I hope you live to be a bazillion years old, but the reality is that there may come a time that I'm having to make decisions for you, and you know how much I love you, and you know how much I respect you. I want to be able to honor you if I am in that position. So can we just talk a little bit about what's important to you? I mean, you've lost friends, you've lost your parents, so let's just talk a little bit. And it doesn't have to be that you have this gut-wrenching, heart-to-heart that day. It's a process. So mom says, oh, I don't want to talk about that. And you say, no, Mom, come on. Just let's talk about what's among your friends and family who've died, what did you think was a good death? What did it look like to you when it went right? What did it look like to you when it went wrong? And when she talks a little bit about Aunt Stell or whatever, you say, well, can we come back and talk about this later? And then the next week you say, Mom, when we talked about Aunt Stell, it made me think about, that if we were in a situation, I wouldn't really know, what you would want. Actually, I think it's interesting that the data are that we think families know, but they really don't know. The researchers tell us you're just as accurate to flip a coin as you are to ask a family member. So without conversation, it's just a game of chance. I was 30 when Mom died, and I was horrified that I would forget everything she had taught me. And I didn't have a computer then, but I wrote down, I typed out a list of all the things that she had taught me. And some of them were silly things, and some of them were profound things. And, all the wonderful things I've said about my mom, I should say she was a horrible cook. Oh, God, she was a horrible cook. If we called home and she told us we were having chicken and dumplings for dinner, my brothers and I were like rats trying to get off of a sinking ship. We would go do anything not to come home and eat Mom's chicken and dumplings. But one of the things on my list was that the name and address of a good baker is worth much more than a whole box of recipes that you're never going to cook. So she was a very pragmatic woman. And, I think I said to you, one of the things she said, you have to have 2 good pair of white linen pants for summer because they're just really hard to keep clean, and it's just really important that you're ready to go. You never know when you'll get an invitation. And, she couldn't cook, but she did beautiful, what she called tablescapes. And so still to this day, I'm a really good cook. But to this day, someone just asked me over the weekend when I planned a menu, how did I figure out what I was going to cook? And I do what my mom taught me. Figure out which plates you're going to use, and then what color they are, and what linens you're going to use, and what flowers would just set that off wonderfully. And then think about what food would look really pretty on that table. So my point in saying that is not only so that people would have some better sense of really what a gal she was, but to also say, you don't need to write down things. The lessons that we learned from our moms and dads about everything from the frivolous, your white linen pants, to those things that are really important about how do you talk about difficult issues in your family, how do you love and respect people at the end of life. And for us, and I think this is true at the center, we talk about this at the center, it's always been families first. I'm pretty old now, and I have struggled with some serious illnesses. And in the long run, I'll share with you what my dad used to say to us, and I could do this whole thing about lessons my daddy taught me. When we were kids, if we said, "Oh, Daddy, I'm bored. I'm not happy," he would say, "There is nothing in the world I want but for you to be happy. And the way you're happy is that you love and care for your family, you find meaningful work, and you do it to the best of your ability, and you recognize that there are always people who have less than you have, and you owe it to them to help them. Now, quit whining and get your ass out there and be happy." So that was my family.